Hi, Bill. How are you?
Hello, Justin. I'm good. Welcome to the DMZ. First time in the DMZ, but not first time on Blogging Heads.
First time. Well, I think I actually replaced you 1 week in the DMZ. I was.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah.
You took the liberal,
I
you took the
attacked
left
Matt
flank
from
for
left.
one day. So Matt's taking a well-deserved vacation. He has not abandoned the show. But you used to work with Matt. So why don't you tell folks a bit about your background and where you are right now?
For the Washington Examiner. My background, I just got done working at the Daily Beast and Newsweek for David Frum. And prior to that, I was Matt's intern last summer at the Daily Caller. So.
Now, I know Matt considers himself a bit of a sworn enemy of David Frum. I don't know if David Frum feels the same way. But was that weird to shift from Matt to David? Matt didn't give you a hard time? So, what I find interesting is that, Matt is not a blind ideologue. He certainly is willing to hold up a mirror to other conservatives and critique conservatives when he feels is appropriate. But he wouldn't be called, I guess, a reformocon, this sort of movement of conservative reformers that David Frum is sort of identified with, as well as maybe, you might know better than me, who's the leading lights, but I would guess, Ramesh Punnaru. Ross Tufit. Worried my video is freezing.
Yeah, it's been almost amusing to watch within DC and New York circles the existential debate over what it means to be a reformicon. Who can be included in this? We had last month the hand-wringing over whether or not Josh Barlow deserves to be called a reformicon, or if we can call him it's essentially a movement that says the Republican Party needs to reshift its priorities.
Though Bauer seemed to say he wasn't even a conservative, he
described himself as a neoliberal. He's a Republican. He doesn't see himself as a conservative, so it's sort of most people, at least within the Beltway circle, most people who are conservative ideas people they don't necessarily identify themselves as Republicans instead of conservatives instead. So Josh is a unique example because he identifies himself as a Republican but not a conservative. So that's it. He gives his critiques an interesting angle, I suppose. But
so where are you?
Squishy conservative. I think the basic critique is that, and the one that I've hammered on for about a year, and it's getting very tired, I think, but I'll probably continue to do so, is basically that the challenge is that modern conservatism sees itself set up to fix. Many of them no longer exist, and many of the ideas that we're proposing are not necessarily as relevant in 2013 as they were perhaps in 1979 or 1980. Which leaves us.
So if it's up to you, or if you were the William F. Buckley dictating the course of the conservative movement, what different ideas or different problems would you be having the movement focus on right now?
I would have us. Well, I suppose I would say this. I like the rhetoric that Ted Cruz applies to it, his laser focus on helping the working class and whatnot. But I think that what you could actually do would be to help steer more money into the hands of poor people, and then help them essentially lift themselves out of poverty. But that would entail.
Now that seems to cut against some of the Romney rhetoric. Even the Rick Perry rhetoric, we can talk Rick Perry later, saying half the nation isn't paying their taxes. We need to have a broader tax base that includes more poor people paying taxes.
I mean, the story of the Reagan Revolution was about getting poor people off the tax rolls. So I think that historical context is always quite useful there. What we spent 20-odd years doing was making sure that poor people not only weren't paying income taxes, but often, for example, the creation of the earned income tax credit, designed to ensure that poor working people were in fact given more money to say, hey, we're proud of you for working, it's a good thing, let's also help raise your standard of living a little bit more. So that, I don't see broadening the base when the people who you'd be broadening the base to, that income is far more precious to them than people at the upper ends.
I mean, considering the earned income tax credit was, a Reagan policy, that conservatives had long supported, and seemingly for understandable reasons, because there's generally been a low-tax party. This swerve in recent years to the Wall Street Journal lucky duckies argument that these lucky duckies are getting off scot-free, which I think the Wall Street Journal did articulate before Obama. But to what extent did that get more broadly embraced because of Obama? Because Obama had the Making Work Pay tax credit as part of the Recovery Act. Were there folks out there that kind of temporarily abandoned their low tax position as a knee-jerk reaction to Obama, or is this really a deeper ideological split, or should I say ideological, your policy fissure within the conservative movement that transcends Obama?
I think a lot of people just lost their minds in the recession, and I don't speak of that on as much of an ideological plane as that you had conservatives not sure how to react to our necessary bailout, and then unsure how to react to the stimulus, and you had congressional leadership in a House and a Senate that were somewhat split from a lot of the intellectual movements, at least within the conservative movement, at least within the conservative part of American politics, and that sort of metastasized over the last 4 or 5 years to the point where you had, Romney's. The front blog was not kind on Romney for his 47% comments. So that's just one issue of yours. I mean, that sort of suggests to me that where your head is at is sort of getting past Obama and getting back to more core conservative principles, as opposed to. Because that doesn't suggest to me a bigger break with orthodoxy. That's more of just, hey, people, get over your Obama derangement syndrome and get back to what we used to be for. Is that kind of where you're at, or are there other ideas that you think conservatives need to embrace that would be new frontiers for conservatism and not getting back to basics? You have to sort of be careful and parse the language there a bit. And the idea of getting back to what we used to be, part of what made conservatism so successful in the 80s and 90s was that it was responding to challenges of the day. We were dealing with stagnation, we were dealing with inflation, we were dealing with government that in a lot of ways was genuinely out of control, and there was a fairly successful rollback in the 80s and 90s. Today, a lot of the challenges seem to suggest that we might need more government in some areas. That might be kind of hopeful. So the challenge is how does the conservative movement recognize some of these realities while still offering a conservative version of what that might look like, of recognizing and creating a consensus that we have problems that need to be addressed, and here's what a Republican version of that solution might be. That's sort of the challenge that is faced by the writers and pundits and whatnot who are on the right side of the aisle.
Now, that's sort of heretical for you to say the words "more government" in any context in the way politics has been discussed lately, but I think I've discussed with that before. To be a conservative is not to be a libertarian. They are different. There's some government. It may be less government than what liberals would want, but conservatism historically has never meant no government. So are you saying that there's a need for a bit of a correction or recalibration from where Reagan took the country, or are you saying that there's some specific problems going on right now? I guess you're suggesting inequality is one of them, where that just can't be solved with a laissez-faire attitude. The government needs to do something. Maybe it's not a big government program the way a liberal might want, but something to deal with. I mean, is inequality one of those problems, or are there other problems that you're thinking of?
There's a whole slew of problems. In terms of the inequality front, one thing I would like to do is give more money to poor people. I would prefer to write them a check instead of creating the bureaucracies to deal with that. And I've struggled with the paternalism issue and whether or not government should actively attempt to influence people's behavior in terms of to make them healthier, to make them want to do things, become more educated. I think a conservative alternative is simply to say we're going to give you money and allow you to spend it as you will. But right now what we have is a...
So you're a George McGovern conservative.
On some of these, I'm just a liberal. I mean, that's where people like to place these, and I love common ground. that in a lot of situations, rather than saying what can government bureaucracy do to say make these people's lives, I mean, better we might just say let's give them money and let them make their own decision. It's a knowledge issue. But on another front, I mean, if we're going to deal with inequality, I mean, one thing Republicans might want to do is significantly increase the earned income tax credit to say, hey, if you're working, that's great. Let's give you more money. Let's make your life a little bit better. Conservatives are going to have to deal with health care in a meaningful way because there's and Ross Douthat had a beautiful column on this earlier this week. He pointed out a split between elected Republicans and intellectual Republicans, that there is a fairly broad consensus within Washington policy circles that the status quo of health insurance, of having it based upon your employer, is not a great one, and that we need to figure out a way to move beyond that. But that elected Republicans are just entirely checked out. And then you have, for Democrats, I suppose I would say, an uncertain narrative having forward of what to do. So it's quite nasty. But Republicans will have to recognize that people in the 21st century want health insurance, and they want better access to health care, and how to provide an alternative that is, I suppose, palatable to the Republican base and palatable to Republican principles that is a challenge.
So would you think if there was a Republican president in 2016 or 2020, after presumably Obamacare has been implemented to a large degree, would you be suggesting a scrapping of it and rebuilding it with something totally different, or are we at the point where we should be saying, look, it is the law, but we think there are ways that could be improved and made better, and here's what those ideas are?
We should have been fixed in 2010. I will sit sort of in squishy territory here, but I've been saying for a couple of years now that we simply need to improve the law. That's it's very heartening to see people like Ezra Klein come out and say, let's scrap the employer mandate. That's good. It's a terrible policy and it shouldn't exist. So let's get rid of it. And the challenge, as he clearly points out, is that there's not much incentive for especially House Republicans to offer reforms to the law, because by reforming and improving the law, you strengthen other parts that you also don't want. It's going to be eventually the question, and once the Obamacare becomes fully implemented, of what you do with it, especially the idea that with a real repeal effort, you have to say, hey, people, you might get off insurance rolls. It's a tough thing to run that. That'll be tough for a lot of House people to do. But
I don't understand. There was a bill that Scott Brown had proposed, I believe with Ron Wyden, back in 2011, 2012, that would have accelerated the date when states could apply for waivers that would allow them to do something different than Obamacare. If you can go to HHS and say, okay, we got a different idea, you'd have to prove that it has some reasonable chance of expanding coverage and lowering costs, and if you could make that case to the feds, they'd say, okay, you don't have to do Obamacare, you can go do your own thing, at least for a time, and see how it works. It would seem that would allow a lot of these Republican governors to experiment and show that they have some better idea. But it seemed that Scott Brown never got a hearing from his other Republicans because it required an acknowledgement that Obamacare wasn't going to go away. You had to get off of the repeal message. But might that be something that could be renewed as an opportunity for conservatives at the state level to show their fresh ideas?
I like it. I don't see it coming, especially the further along the implementation process goes, the less likely that is to have a real chance of coming to fruition. So,
although I should point out that under current law, that will happen in 2017. So the way the current law is structured, you got to try Obamacare for a few years, essentially, because it gets fully implemented in 2014. You got 3 years with it, and then if you want to try something different, then you can come to us. So that's going to be the case no matter what. So I wonder, if nothing else, if folks like you should be crafting those state-based ideas so you could be ready to pounce and you're talking someone's ear at the state level and say, here's your chance to show that we have our own fresh ideas.
Yeah, I like that very much. I would point out that in the broadest sense that I would prefer to see Obamacare implemented as quickly as possible, simply because there's quite a few things within it that I don't think are going to work especially well, and I'd like the public to feel those things as quickly as possible. it's one of those where some of the things I fear that keep getting pushed back are things that are going to be incredibly unpopular, and I would prefer that they be not, to allow the public to actually to know and respond to the parts of it. Simply put, I don't think that you're going to see a repeal of Obamacare ever. I didn't think you were going to see it in 2010. I didn't think you were going to see it in 2012. I don't think you're going to see it in 2014 or 2016. The problem that we have is what I think Connecticut Continental described as a double bind, which is that going crazy after Obamacare is very successful if you're trying to win a House election or if you're winning a Senate election in a red state. But it's not ever going to get you back into the White House. So you have this
sort of raises a bigger. I'm sorry, continue.
So it creates this terrible double incentive for House and Senate Republicans to continue crusading against it in toto, rather than simply to fix certain parts of it or to offer an alternative that would have any chance of electoral success. And it leaves candidates for president completely hamstrung because they can't. To win a primary, you're going to have to offer something that's never going to succeed in a general.
I mean, this seems to speak to a larger box the Republican Party is in. What works for them to keep the House, in theory, is not what works to make the party competitive nationally, take back the Senate, win the White House. In part because the way the districts are drawn, they're gerrymandered to maximize conservative influence. In part because incumbents are generally hard to dislodge if they don't stick their necks out. So you have a situation where there's a layer of the Republican Party. Some of the elites feel like we have to make some changes. We have to change on health care. We got to change on inequality. We got to change on immigration or other issues. And the House is not letting us, stretch our legs. And I think I suggest this with at some point, maybe it was a map, maybe it was in a column, that Democrats had to lose 3 times. They had to lose with Reagan twice, and then Bush v. Dukakis before the liberals were flat on their back in '92, and they said, "Fine, Bill Clinton, go ahead and reform welfare. Go ahead and execute a mentally retarded person. Whatever, we got to win. We got to cut our losses here." Is it possible that you're on the same arc where you haven't quite lost enough yet before some of these more stubborn conservatives are just going to say, "Fine, I get it. We're not getting anywhere. We can't just be content with holding on to the House by a hair. We got to make some changes." You need to lose one more time before folks like you and the other reformocons get a hearing.
Well, I certainly hope not, because it also required Ross Perot for Bill Clinton to win in '92. So
I would debate that point, but continue.
I just certainly hope it doesn't require that. There are a few basic things, and a few things that I think the GOP could do reasonably quickly, which would, for instance, it was a huge mistake to allow the payroll tax to reset to its normal rate. And the difference, if I remember correctly, that is the final ending of making work pay, was it not?
Right. So, making work pay expired in 2010 and was replaced by the temporary payroll tax cut. And then, as far as a fiscal cliff deal at the top of 2013, they let that payroll tax cut expire with no other replacement.
Right. Its origin was making work pay, correct?
Yeah, I mean, it's not quite a one-for-one swap. There are different people that got help with the payroll tax cut, that got help with the making work pay, but they had a similar goal of trying to keep taxes low during this economic sluggish time.
Well, they're trying to do 2 things. They're trying to keep taxes low, but they're also trying to not give a quick infusion. They're trying to make it slow and steady so people didn't notice the difference. I mean, it was again playing the behavioral game, trying to influence people's actions, and that one sort of seemed to work. But no, I hope it doesn't take till after 2016. The things that I would worry about are the GOP can pretty quickly seize upon a few things I think are reasonable. A would be to accept the status quo in terms of the income tax, and to shift its priorities and focus to payroll tax. And by shifting its priorities and focus to payroll tax, you would almost automatically be shifting your focus on tax cuts to the middle and working class instead.
So if you're going to lower the payroll tax permanently, I mean, the issue with that was when they lowered it for a temporary period of time, they were replacing the Social Security and Medicare trust fund revenue out of the general pot of funds, and the argument was you couldn't do that forever. I mean, you could do it for a couple of years and it would be a big deal, but to do it forever would weaken the rest of government. Are you suggesting to replace that stream of funds elsewhere? Or are you suggesting that it just should not be replaced, and you think that would be okay?
I prefer not to replace it, but I think we can.
So what would that do to the trust fund?
Internal revenues as we do. We've fairly well abused the trust fund for decades now, and programs are still there, and programs will be there no matter how we continue to abuse the trust fund. It's sort of, I suppose it's a cynical way of looking at it, but
this is not an evil plot of yours to make Social Security and Medicare shrivel and die.
See the comment section when I write about this. A monster is trying to take away grandma's Social Security. I always have to remind them that my grandmother received Social Security, so I have at least a degree of self-interest in making sure the program remains at least intact. I think most of the broad goals the GOP could pretty quickly recognize are to say that the status quo of a roughly 40% top income tax rate is acceptable enough to focus and shift to saying let's lower the tax burdens for people who make between $20,000 and $50,000 a year, and let's try to help people who are in that same range have better access to higher ed and have better access to getting health care. Because I think where the Republicans need to be careful is focusing less on health insurance and saying that people need to have access to affordable health care instead. And I think we would see where that goes from there. The simplest reality is that Republicans are not going to be able to outbid Democrats in some issues. Like, I'm quite opposed to efforts in the House to hijack this "don't double my rate" conversation and to play this game of why aren't Democrats working to lower student loan rates? I prefer those rates go back to some degree of a market level. So we're going to have problems there, but the GOP will respond as every political party does to the desire to win. So
you're expressing some optimism that some of these reform ideas might get embraced by the Republicans before 2016.
Not really. No.
Is that just hope? I guess you're in the soup. You're in the Beltway. I assume you go to conservative parties. You brush up against other folks. Are you getting a hearing? I mean, are folks happy that you are raising these issues, and the other reformer cons, or are you guys being generally derided as rhinos who are some sort of fifth column out to destroy the conservative movement?
To tell you the truth, I work very hard at parties to not talk about what I do for a job. Less for the ostracism factor than because I already do it 60, 70 hours a week. I'd rather not do it in my social life as well.
Well, perhaps not a cocktail hour, but just in your general 9 to 5 life, even if it's going to within the offices of the Examiner or other kind of think tank symposiums you might go to. I mean, what kind of feedback do you get?
So we get some. What I think is going to be interesting to watch for in 2016 is whether from the primaries emerge someone who is sort of this libertarian populist model that we discussed, or if it's going to be a moderate governor. So it's probably going to be whether we see Bobby Jindal or Chris Christie. I think I'm not using the two because I think it's the two that likely to merge, but it's because of a model of what kind of candidate we might see. And I suspect in 2016 the candidate that will is Bobby Jindal and not Christie. Or at least someone like Bobby Jindal and not someone like Chris Christie.
I mean, Jindal got a pretty big whack. Yeah, and I think it was a New Republic this week, which suggested that
are at odds,
his poll numbers are way down. David Vitter is ascendant. Jindal and Vitter seem to not like each other.
But the point of that piece was also that you can't just ignore your own politics. And so it was sort of amusing to see the governor of the state losing touch with his local politics, while the senator who spends most of his time in Washington is the one who is rebuilding the ties. But we will see what the.
But you think that's not that his death is
I don't think that says
political death is premature.
Much about the national political scene. No, I think that's more a personal thing. Jindal had some issues with his attempt to implement the fairly substantial income tax cuts, but I don't think that was something that was going to lose an election in Louisiana. I think it's something that would probably play considerably well on the national, certainly on the national conservative scene. But
so what does he? I mean, you're the main talk for 2016 so far has been Christie, Rubio, and Paul, Rand Paul. I think those folks have pulled the best so far. Jindal certainly is polling second tier nationally as it stands, although that's not necessarily at all a reason why he couldn't get the nomination. Bill Clinton was in Nowheresville, 3 years prior. Barack Obama was necessarily not polling very strongly next to Hillary Clinton in 2005. But what do you think he's going to bring to the table that a Christie or a Rubio or a Paul would not?
I'm not much of a Jindal fan personally. I think it's going to be something like that. You're going to see someone like a Jindal or a Rand Paul who are ideologically are quite similar, or even to a lesser extent like a Ted Cruz. I mean, people who are fairly hardline about being considerably more of a libertarian than a traditional conservative Republican. So we'll see if the party decides to march in that direction, or if they go with someone like a Christie or to an extent, very unlikely, someone like a Rubio. I'm not sure. I personally think Rubio has really diminished his chances of winning a Republican primary over the last year or so. And I don't think.
Well, I want to talk about that
in a debate as is. So.
I'd like to talk about that more in a little bit, as well as the Rick Perry news. But I'm curious how you're grouping Cruz and Paul, because I would not consider those folks to be reformer cons. I would consider them to be kind of libertarian fringe.
There is no reformer con in that race. Reformer con is
fair enough.
But
Jindal might be the closest.
Hundreds and hacks. It's like I use hacks like in a positive sense.
But you think that. So you're not considering them reformer cons, but you consider them folks who have a hardline libertarian view that would shake up the Republican establishment that has appeal to the primary base. At that point, is that a fair characterization of what you're saying?
Tea Party vote.
And you think a Tea Party candidate's going to win the nomination?
The question is, will they? And so we will see. I think the GOP will have to make a choice in 2016 between, and a real choice, probably for the first time. They'll have the offering of a Tea Party candidate, be that a senator or be that a state governor, or they can go with a more establishment-minded candidate. So I think that's what we will see. And traditionally, the establishment candidate just won out, but we don't know in 2016. At this point, there really is no front runner, so we just have no clue.
Now, I'd written a piece on Rubio last week that I talked about with Matt, just that Rubio, and I'm for immigration reform. I have a lot of respect for what Rubio has done to stick his neck out with immigration reform. But objectively, I do think he has hurt himself, not just within the Republican Party. I mean, I think he's hurt himself both ways, in that the diehard conservatives who saw him as a Tea Party fellow traveler now see him as someone who's betrayed that movement by being a compromiser on immigration. But at the same time, he didn't position himself well to actually show he was essential to seal the deal. He got sidetracked with John Cornyn's border security amendment, which failed, and the final amendment that did seal the deal was the Corker-Hoven amendment that Rubio didn't have much to do with. And so he's not really seen as the savior of immigration reform either, so that he loses both ways, and his stature is diminished, though I offered some ideas how he could recapture it. Though some polling still shows that he still polls near the top in 2016, although obviously it's very early, but it doesn't seem like he has cratered amongst Republican primary voters, but it does mean he's lost a bit of the argument why he's a unique leader that shouldn't be denied the nomination.
Yeah, I think, it's important to remember that voting memories are pretty short, that what he does in 2013 will probably not have significant impact on what happens in the spring of 2016, at least within Republican primary. I just don't see that really happening, especially if the bill ends up failing. I don't think it's going to hurt him either way. But he sort of has lost he's lost his sense of being a fairly unique candidate. In the in the way that, like, I mean, he's not a Rand Paul, he's not a Ted Cruz, he's not even Christie. He's a fairly hawkish, sort of Tea Party friendly candidate with not much experience and not much of a legislative record. And if he does achieve a major legislative success, it'll be one that's unpopular with the voters. So we'll see. At least, I'm sorry, with the voters that will be voting in a Republican primary. So.
Now, do you think Rick Perry, who just announced he would not run for a fourth term as governor, but hinting he could run for president a second time, is he someone that could capture this Tea Party base, give as good as he could get from a Chris Christie or a Marco Rubio?
No, not really. I don't think he's
perhaps.
Honestly, that's. I think he was pretty content being the governor of Texas. I don't think he had to work very hard to be it. I mean, he inherited the job from President Bush, and despite a few different challenges, his job was never wildly in peril. The closest one was he had to survive that primary with Kay Bailey Hutchinson, but he pulled it off pretty well. And I don't think he wants to deal with with the struggles for the 2016 campaign, especially when he's going to get, assaulted on either which end for the way he is. I mean, the national media remembers since that oops moment, but as Ben Dominic pointed out this morning, what killed him was that he supported the DREAM Act, and that he went after his fellow candidates for not supporting it. So, A, I don't think he has the heart or the drive to go do the race, and B, I just think his time has passed. He's fine to go into the shadows, as much as a three-term governor of Texas can go into the shadows.
Well, let's talk about immigration for a bit, because it's still the main plank of Obama's second-term agenda that is alive, and I sense there's a lot of skepticism that it can clear the final hurdles, because Boehner is certainly being very difficult about just taking the Senate bill as it is. And the House caucus seems to want to move in a much more conservative direction than the Democratic Senate would be willing to accept. But it still seems to me that there's pretty big appetite amongst the Republican elites for this. A sense that that this is the minimum they have to do to get back in the good graces of the Latino community. If they don't do that, they can never be a national party for the next generation. There's plenty of Republican donor money in support of that view. They're running a lot of ads giving political cover to Rubio and others who voted for this. And a piece that I wrote at ourfuture.org this week about some of the comments made by the House Homeland Security Committee chair. It's Mike McCowd, I believe, if I'm remembering his name correctly. He was just on CBS's Face the Nation, and he had been for a couple weeks now deriding the Senate bill as wasteful government spending, just throwing money at the problem, not having a real plan. He has a real plan. He passed a bill in his committee that was actually a unanimous vote, bipartisan vote. It was a pretty generic bill saying that Homeland Security has to have a plan. They have to meet this 90% metric of apprehensions at the border. But he's touting it as like a real plan, whereas the Senate bill is not a plan; it's just money. So he got some headlines after his Sunday show appearance, deriding the Senate bill as just giving out candy. But elsewhere in the interview, he also said that he thought the House was going to pass pieces and not comprehensive legislation, but that they would then go into House-Senate conference, which is what he thought should happen, and he hopes there would be a bill, because failure, he thinks the president wants failure to blame the House and try and use that to take back the House. So he was sort of making an argument why it would be good to compromise with Obama to prevent him from this evil political plot of his. And so it struck me that it would not be hard to take his House border security plan and match it with Senate money. That's not in conflict with each other. There'd be this tough issue about what you do with this 90% metric. Is that a hard trigger or an aspirational goal? I think they have a hard time around that. but something that could theoretically be compromised on. And it would not be odd for the House to pass various piecemeal legislation, go to conference, either merge it with the comprehensive bill or agree to pass the comprehensive bill in pieces with a wink, wink, nod, nod that, hey, House, if you only pass the border security part and not the legalization part, this goes nowhere in the Senate, so you better do the whole thing at the end of the day. If you want a bill at the end of the day, you could find that path, and the Homeland Security chair was not saying anything that would negate that path. I mean, so it comes down to, do you believe they have the will or don't you? And I would think that the political embarrassment of what would likely be massive protests from the Latino community if the House killed the bill outright, which happened 7 years ago. There were millions of Latinos in the streets after the House passed a bill that was going to criminalize undocumented workers, make them felons. The Senate then freaked out because this Republicans controlled both houses. They saw all that street heat, and the Senate said, well, we're not going to go down that road. And they actually passed the bill that had pathway to citizenship, and then they just gridlocked. And in 2006, that was good for the Latino community because they stopped what would have been an awful House bill. Gridlock now will be seen as a defeat because they're so hopeful that this final bill would pass. What would happen to the Republican Party if you had millions in the streets after this? I think that a lot of leadership wants to avoid that, and therefore I can see them, biting the bullet, taking on the Tea Party, allowing compromise to go through. That's how I see things. I don't know if you think that's a plausible outcome here.
We'll find out this summer. I think probably the most interesting, maybe amusing is the wrong word to use here, given the context, but the lack of interest that I've seen from people in wondering why GOP mega donors are so insistent upon immigration reform and why they're so fine with it. It's been amusing to me to watch people say, the good of, I don't know, their own economic interests, but that's the one we'll see. Speaker Boehner has been slowly becoming more clear that he's probably not going to sidestep what's called the Hastert rule, which is that there has to be a majority in favor of a bill to allow it to go to the floor and do a vote. So unless he has a change of heart, unless he really pulls a fast one, I don't think he has a chance to go anywhere. And if he was to go against it, he'd be essentially filing his papers of retirement for the House. There was, if you remember, that ill-fated attempt to produce a coup on Speaker Boehner at the start of the session that failed in pretty embarrassing form. I don't think it would fail this time if he went against what he's been pretty clear about and allowed immigration to go through with just a couple dozen Republican votes and the entirety of the Democratic caucus.
I think there's a way for him to get around Hastert, or at least use Hastert to his advantage. I mean, you could use the Hastert rule now for your piecemeal legislation, which will all be too right-wing to go through the Senate, but it would get you to conference. So they pass with mostly House votes and almost no Democratic votes, but you get to conference. Then once you're at conference, I guess the question is...
of course the idea is simply that you get anything through the House, basically anything that has the word immigration on it, and then you can deal with it in conference.
Right,
and
so the question is
and then you can pressure the House to say, well, here's a bill, let's at least give us a vote.
Right.
And assuming that by just giving us a vote, they'll get it done.
And there was a Daily Beast piece by Michelle Cottle on this where she quoted some anonymous House aide saying, look, Boehner could get private Hastert rule assurances, yeah, I'm for it, or yeah, it's okay that you bring it to the floor. And then at the end of the day, maybe he doesn't get the majority votes, but Boehner can have the cover to say, look, I did ask everybody. I asked if it was okay, and they said go ahead. It's a question of will. Are there some House members there who at the end of the day wanted to go to the floor, don't want the House to be smacked upside the head by angry Latino voters, may not want to put their own vote on the record for it, but do want to get it there? Will they give Boehner that leeway if Boehner jumps all these other hurdles to get to conference, tries to strike a bit of a better deal from a House perspective, and they can say, hey, he did his best.
Well, that we will see. I have to say, I would probably be surprised if that would be the end result. Because most House members are expecting something similar to that. Boehner's game is that he does what you just described. He will say, oh, well, I'm not going to allow this to happen, and then he goes and he allows the Senate to pass something first, and then he will slowly walk something through and say, oh, obviously if we can't pass this, it's not going to happen. I understand my party's in opposition. And then all of a sudden you'll turn around and it'll been voted on, and about 3 dozen Republicans will vote for it, and the Democrats will accept it, and you'll have a bill. I think this one, you're probably going to see a lot of preemptive opposition to anything in the House, under the assumption that if it gets to committee, it will be significantly more likely to pass. So you'll probably see this strange optics of watching House Republican people voting against things that ordinarily they would be quite fond of supporting, because they're concerned about letting any kind of bill go to conference.
Now, where are you at? Because you're kind of a reformer con. I think there are a lot of reformer cons who are for immigration reform, who think that this is a necessary recalibration. Matt has made a very, very impassioned argument that this should be done on policy grounds, not political grounds, that it's conservative to embrace immigrants. These are hardworking entrepreneurs. They should be with us and not against us.
Well, on the simple policy grounds, I think the United States should be a little more discerning in its immigration policy. Like, I'm quite opposed to efforts, particularly within my own party, to create guest worker programs. I think it's very problematic. I would prefer not to be like an Arab state bringing in a substantial amount of people with no chance at all of ever becoming citizens and saying, yeah, you work for us, and your conditions won't be that great, and you simultaneously drive down the wage floor for people within our country. And we'll do that on the grounds of simple policy. I think this bill probably needs to go down. I think something reasonably similar to it should eventually pass. But
so what aspect of it is your hang-up?
My hang-up? I don't think the enforcement stuff would ever be allowed to stand, and I think the strongest opposition will probably come from groups like Cato.
But Cato has been supportive of it so far, yes?
Right. I mean, it's groups like Cato, like these, that will challenge things that you verify on grounds of being unconstitutional, and challenge, especially a strong. You think
they're going to bait and switch? They'll back the bill, then sue certain parts of it.
Yeah, I mean, so the Republican opposition is grounded in the idea that Obama cannot be trusted to enforce the bill. People are pointing out, say, like this delay on Obamacare somehow signals that you can't trust in immigration.
Isn't that an idiotic argument, though? He's only around for 2.5 more years. Why would that be the basis for junking a permanent bill when the guy you don't trust is going to go?
Well, because the assumption is it's wait 2.5 years, then you can get a more favorable deal. I mean,
that's a different argument.
Well, not necessarily. The argument is that that we've been waiting for 20-odd years to pass immigration reform, and that 2.5 more years probably is going to make a massive difference, and I don't think there's a strong argument in opposition to that.
But it's a different argument to say, I think this is a good bill, and I think Homeland Security should do these things, but I don't trust these guys to do it. That's a different argument than saying, I don't like this bill, maybe it's not the worst, but we can get a better bill if we wait 2.5 years. Those are different arguments. The argument coming from that.
We live in a very real world where you can't take a bill as simply a piece of paper. I mean, you have to trust that the parts of it that are crucial to a bill will be implemented in a timely manner, and that you won't have bureaucratic maneuvering, and that you won't have your own ostensible political allies going to the courts to try to remove parts of the bill that are essential to it. I have no reason to believe that the ACLU and Cato won't go to the Supreme Court if necessary to try to strip anything that includes a strong entry-exit biometric system, or to try to strip out an verify that would be far more effective than any real border security solution.
Those sorts of things, I mean, any bill you try to pass will be litigated by somebody. You try to craft a bill that will be impervious to those sorts of challenges. You do the best you can. Any bill you craft,
why I want
some level of trust needs to be. What's that?
I said this. That's why I want a Republican to do it, not a Democrat.
But the pendulum's always going to swing. There's always going to be people there's always, someone out there is going to sue, whether they were for your bill or not. Administrations are always going to change. No, I feel this trust argument is a BS argument for people who don't really want to enact a bill. I mean, which is, that's your fine. But I just think that's a serious argument. I mean, if you have a problem,
really, I mean, the deal you're offering is simply that we exchange real border enforcement in exchange for what amounts to an amnesty. We can play with the language there, but that's essentially what Democrats and Republicans are exchanging. And so when one side of the transaction sees that people can receive registered provisional status before there's any real border or E-Verify enforcement that actually takes place, there's reason for skepticism. But I don't think it's BS to say that, oh goodness, perhaps we want to actually see E-Verify in action before we give out provisional status.
Well, you can negotiate that in the bill and say, okay, if that's your
negotiate that, we've been quite unsuccessful. So I don't see it's not necessarily a crazy idea to say perhaps we walk away and wait for a Republican White House, where we can get a bill that might perhaps be more in favor of what we want.
I mean, if you're concerned that E-Verify can't hold up in the courts, why can't you write language that you feel more confident will hold up in the courts? So if they try to sue, that they won't win. I mean, what if you're that concerned that it's susceptible to challenge? I think that's the problem to fix, then, right?
I think I'm less concerned about it being overturned by the courts than an administration says, look, it's going to the courts, so we're just going to delay and delay and delay. Bill Boss wrote about this on quite a big basis. The issue is not that, like, I don't really have much concern about future waves of immigration from Mexico. Mexico is a country that's sort of quietly becoming prosperous due to a variety of factors, including NAFTA kicking in and cheap U.S. natural gas and hopefully eventually ending drug war. But the future waves of immigration we're going to get are going to be places like Central Africa and places like South Asia. And so the question isn't how do we secure a border, it's how do we make it difficult to get an American job if you don't have the right to work in the United States. So I prefer to hold out for something that we can get there. And I think that I would prefer a Republican administration to a Democratic one. And when it comes to implementing and creating timetables that would be successful, perhaps, in deterring future waves of mass migration. That's where we're going to be the hang-up.
It's a hell of a bargain. If you think it's a problem, and it's why it needs to be solved, to then say, well, I'm going to wait until Republicans control the whole operation until you actually do it. There's time where holding out for something better is a sensible thing to do, but you clearly have a very high level of expectation from those most impacted by this legislation, the families most impacted by this legislation who want it now. You're going to have to go back to them and say, sorry I screwed your plan, but trust me, it's going to be much better if you wait a few years. That strikes me as a hard argument to make.
Well, hard arguments to make are why we're in this town, correct?
That's one way to look at it.
It's a simple one. If you'll note, the considerable amount of the opposition to this bill is coming from the people you described as reform opponents, because what this bill essentially does is it has united. I would suppose, like I'm using the corporate instance, united Republican business interests with Democratic labor groups who don't see much of a future in the private sector, so they simply want to concentrate power in the public sector and to figure that more Democratic voters available, the better. But we're in a strange situation where we have a bill that being put forward combined with a guest worker program that should be ended as quickly as possible, and it's being put forth in an administration that has not given us an exceptional amount of reason to trust it to bureaucratically implement what will be an immensely complex process.
Well, I
do have a quick note that
sure.
The only, I suppose, incredibly amusing part of the process was watching Jeff Sessions, very conservative Republican from Alabama, embracing the border agent union. So watching a conservative Republican standing with border agent unions and watching Democrats attacking that union and watching the establishment Republican. I mean, it was just this bill has made a massive cluster of traditional American politics. So,
as immigration usually does.
Yeah, I mean, there's sort of a reason for that. There's a reason for that is a substantial amount of the Republican base does not see this as good for their economic self-interest. And you also
that to me seems to be more of the, or at least part of more of the more substantive divide here. I feel some of these other arguments I still find the whole trust argument kind of bogus because there's really nothing Obama has done to argue mistrust as to his handling of the border, implementation for their bureaucratic programs. I mean, all those sorts of arguments.
What you're asking us to trust is that to grant provisional status now, in return for the plan to someday down the road implement and verify and to establish a secure border. And I'm not necessarily a border hawk because, as I've said, I don't think that future waves will be coming from Mexico. Most of them will be most likely on visa overstays, as about half of them are now. And so the question becomes, how do you make it expensive to get an American job? And you can always prices. We'll probably never be able to stop absent some very, very unseemly biometric systems. We'll never be able to truly stop people from being able to get fake documents, but we will be able to make it more difficult and more expensive. So how do you raise the barrier of entry there to the point where it makes more sense for people to take a legal route into the United States?
I mean, I don't think you have a trust fund. I think you don't like the bill, which is fine. You don't have to like the bill, but it's not like you like the basic parameters of it, but you trust the individuals involved in implementing it. It sounds like you just don't like the entire concept.
I just told you I don't like the basic parameters of the bill.
Well, that's fine. I mean,
the basic parameter of the bill is that you should put enforcement before you have a legalization, and it simply does. The bill does not do that, and that is why it does. What it asks agencies to do is to present a plan for how it's going to do these things, and then it says that big businesses will have to wait roughly 5 years to do an e-verify. And of course, it will take time to implement the system, but I'm not disputing that. My question is why we have a legalization that comes prior to the implementation of any real enforcement measures. That's the one. That's the challenge that policymakers are not really confronted.
Last question to you.
Yeah.
I mean, the hope still is that Republicans win everything so they can do things on their own terms. Would it be better to do nothing for 2.5 years or 6 years until that moment comes? Or would it be better to do something that might be imperfect that can be fixed once Republicans do finally win?
Well, sure. One thing that we should do this session is that Congress should act and actually do a DREAM Act. I mean, the president did it fairly unilaterally last summer. And it's probably a smart move. Congress should come in now and give it, should actually create a law that does this. And Cantor has expressed support for doing this. I would like to see them also rework the way they do the high-end visas, the H-1Bs. I think we should probably just simply auction those off. Those are valuable things. People want to come to this country. They have skills. They want to contribute. Great. Let's do that. And I would like to get the enforcement stuff rolling now. I'd like to get bills that started now to actually create
my suggestion is, I don't think that's if this bill goes down, I think nothing's going to happen. You're going to have a stalemate.
I think even if it goes down, I imagine certainly before 2014 you'll see DREAM Act.
I'm saying, is it better from your perspective to pass this imperfect bill that might get implemented imperfectly, but which could then perhaps be fixed from your perspective once Republicans win everything? Is that a better policy outcome from your perspective than nothing happening for 2 to 6 years until that day of Republican ascendance comes?
Mm-hmm. No, it's a fair question. I would counter it quickly by saying that I think if Republicans assist in passing this bill, they're not going to move back to power for some time because they're going to sign off the last elements of their base without receiving an immediate uptick in prospective new elements. And the thing that doesn't get considered is that you won't have new voters for 14, 16 years, and that you won't have a meaningful change in perhaps an Hispanic vote for Republicans it'll take decades. I mean, these are long-term experiential things that take time for people's opinions of the party to change. I would prefer, I think, for the bill to go down rather than taking a perfect one. I think that it is, yes, a crisis to have 12 million odd people in the country who you don't know who they are. You don't have a system to figure out what they're doing, and they don't have any kind of normalized status. But I think it would be a bigger mistake, and I think it would be just setting up for another round of this. So I would prefer to take the time and do it right. And I do think that we could get a few things done pretty quickly. The House would very quickly agree to DREAM Act. The House would very quickly agree to fixing our H-1B system. But the pushback I've gotten from people, especially from what is now the Working Group of 7 for Democrats, is that it has to be comprehensive because it has to be comprehensive so that the farm lobby and unions can get their guest worker program. It has to be comprehensive so that Democratic leadership gets what amounts to amnesty. It has to be comprehensive so that Republicans get their desired enforcement provisions. And it's this three-legged, it's not a Leviathan, it's like a little mess that relies on everyone to secure their votes. It's sort of like what the Farm Bill was, of combining food stamps with farm subsidies in the hopes that people will just keep voting for it lest they lose everything. I think we've got to break down the way we do immigration reform. Otherwise, we're just going to have crap. It's a convoluted way to finish it, but I think it's probably the best answer we get out of me.
Well, it was great talking to you. Thanks for stepping up while Matt was on vacation. Where can folks find your work?
You can find me on Twitter at jgreendc, which will be linked below when you watch this video. And I will be writing at the Washington Examiner, so read me there.
Excellent. Great to have you. Hope we can have you back soon.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
We should have Matt back next week here at the DMZ. Take care.